Hi folks, Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about freedom of the press, I guess, is the overall sort of, the umbrella issue here, but doing a bit of a dive into how we came from what was largely a freedom of the press into what today is certainly in the mainstream legacy media is close to zero freedom of the press, and the time frame of how that came about, and indeed the background economics to it as well, which play very much into this discussion. So now what got me going on this was watching the people at Davos talking about controlling the media and the information. Now, they do two sort of pretty scary things. One, they say that misinformation and disinformation are the biggest threats to the globalist world order. No surprises there, but or their perception of it is no surprise. And it's they assert that it's a bigger threat than global warming or these other issues that they love to, fear porn issues that they love to push. And again, it's all part of the wider fear porn sort of narrative type thing that they're using. But in order to impose the globalist project, which is against the wishes of the people, indeed it's in direct defiance of the wishes of the people, in order to impose the globalist project, and it is being imposed from above by a small elite, they must have total control of the information flow if they have any chance of pulling this off. So this is what they mean by misinformation, disinformation. Any information that in any way interferes or disrupts or dilutes the potency and effectiveness of the lies, that is the narrative that they need to tell and think that they must tell in order to impose the globalist project. So it's all about imposing the globalist project. That's at the root of all this. So now any questions about the globalist project are obviously unwelcome. Any criticisms are particularly unwelcome, and any evidence that shows just the extent to which we're being duped, and the Western citizens in particular, how we're being quite ruthlessly disenfranchised in many ways, economically, politically, basic freedoms are all being taken away, again, as part of the globalist project being imposed. But the fact that we might take issue with it or complain about it, then that has to be stopped. So they get the arbitrary right to decide what is and what isn't mis or disinformation in their terms. And they also have the right to, as they see it, and they see they have an undeniable right. But if you can query their right, then you are engaging in, as they would see it, you're defying, their power. And if you defy their power, they want to crush you. And whether they accuse you of putting disinformation out or whatever, they'll accuse you of something, and they want to shut all this down. And so there's only one voice that speaks in 1984 George Orwell terms. There's only one voice speaking, and it is a voice of absolutely unanimous narrative pushing, and no other voice or questions or is allowed. And just listening to the people sort of talk about these are people who've, it's like children playing doll's house. They seem to have an understanding of the real world that was so childlike and silly, and gender studies first year university low IQ student. It was a low IQ view. It just seems looking at just, again, children playing doll's house. They were just ideologues, not people that wanted to introduce or create practical solutions to practical issues. And as they see it, we're imposing the globalist project. That's the issue they're addressing. Anything else is secondary. And in anything else, any suffering or pain is collateral damage, which you always see with ideologues, by the way, whether it's the Soviet Union communist ideologues or the Mao Zedong Chinese communist Pol Pot Okay, it doesn't matter when you're imposing an ideology, you're pursuing that nirvana, that perfect society that you imagine in your doll's house mentality exists. Then you're prepared to again accept any collateral damage. It could be tens of millions, 20 million, 50 million people dying. Doesn't matter. That's just collateral damage because you're chasing that perfect society that you imagine to exist in your doll's house rationale of the world. But coming to how did it come to this? How were they able to get this much control of the media? Because as they see it, they've got control of the biggest arms of the media. They didn't quite foresee how social media would take off. They didn't predict that. And so they're trying to somehow find a way of controlling it. And they're going through various means and devices and rationale for doing it. And if you look at the CIA and FBI involvement in creating the Googles and the Facebooks and all that sort of thing, they obviously did perceive back in the day that this would be, or potentially could be, a new frontier of communications. And this is why, those companies were stunningly successful, defying all gravity rules in stock market prices and share prices, and how they were allowed degrees of monopoly control without interference by the government and so on. So they clearly perceived that this, the Metas, or what today is Meta, and the Googles, that would all be the YouTubes and everything. That would all be a very important part of the public square, but they didn't know how much, and they didn't know in what way and how it would unfold and this sort of thing. So they kept the thinking that we can control the brand name high trust news sites, the New York Times, that sort of stuff, the mastheads, the brands. If we can control that, we can control the information. And they didn't realize just how much communication would fall outside of that. And as they tightened their propaganda grip using the mastheads, again, the New York Times stuff, as they tightened their propaganda grip, because remember, they're trying to impose the globalist project. They need to control information, and they need to control what we think, what we see, what we hear, so what we read. So this sort of control, as they tighten their control, the amount of propaganda, thus the lies, deceit, the treachery, and the underhandedness, that increased, which then reduced the trust that people had in those brands, and that was reflected. People were able to talk about it on social media, and that was something they didn't foresee, or certainly didn't predict the scale of it, and so they're scrambling to make good on that now to shut off those other avenues. But I just want to go through, and I've mentioned this sort of in the past, that when I left school and college and all that sort of stuff, there was a guy I knew who went to be at the days, as they called it back then, a cadet journalist at one of the premier mastheads in Australia, and it was considered to be the final word. It was the standard in accuracy, and they really had an emphasis on that. And I used to meet him every now and again. We'd have a beer or a coffee or something, and he would tell me about he got, this is a cadet journalist, he got sent to cover, it was something basic like a pie baking contest, and there's some politician's wife was going to be there, so he got sent to cover it, and he got one of the flavorings wrong in the pie. He said it was a lamb and rosemary pie, flavored pie, but it wasn't. It was actually lamb and pepper or so. It was a minor thing. It was a pie, and he got everything right except for the flavoring. And he got dragged in and got a caning by the editor, and the caning was that, hey, we are the standard for accuracy. Anything we print, you can rely on to be 100% factual accurate. And I don't care if you got the wrong flavoring in a pie. Don't give a shit. That is an inaccuracy, can't be tolerated. If you want to be a journalist here, then it is 100% accurate. If you weren't sure, you should have checked. You should have gone back to the source. Or if there was you have two sources, one says it's this spice or herb, and the other says that, then you go to a third source. But the amount of rigor that was applied and the exactitude that the editors required from the journalist, even something as simple as a fucking pie baking code, and it flowed through into their coverage of, say, politics and other things like that. Now, that was then. This is pre-internet times, of course. I'm like a punk kid at this time, and the internet, certainly in the format of today, didn't even exist at the time. Hardly anybody had a personal computer even then. Oh, some people did, but it was, to buy not an entry level, but one even with a personal computer with minor tricked up functionality back in the time, with a printer, was, say, $7,000 back then. So this is going back. $7,000 was for back in the time was like 2 months' pay. Very few people could afford that. So especially something that had no practical purpose, like you couldn't drive it to work or use it in some way. So this was definitely pre-internet days. So the newspapers were the source of accuracy. Now, you see that same sort of standard maybe starting to slip, but you see it in the New York Times and some other mastheads. Not that they didn't have their opinion piece sections that they used to rave and rant about all sorts of nonsense. They did. But there was usually particular journals that had that gossipy type nature, or gossipy type structure of news or half news, or just crazy stuff like people coming aliens from outer space come and bite dog or something. You had that as well, but it was you knew it was rubbish. You knew it was nonsense, and you could buy those things and have a good laugh every now and again. Some of the insane type headlines you'd see, but there were those standards that you knew. If I got that newspaper, I knew that it was accurate, that I could rely on that information. If they said something was a fact, it was a fact, and the analysis was very dry. They didn't go far outside of the facts, and you could do a the connection between fact A and fact B was very direct, very well supported, very well argued, and so on. So that was the situation then. Now, excuse me. That sort of started to change as the internet started to play a bigger role in the distribution of news. Excuse me. I guess a few things. As the internet was starting to take a bigger role, at the same time, the Globalist project was being more aggressively introduced. Now, the government, as the Globalist project began to sort of take a bigger, and I didn't see it at the time, it's one of those things that sort of happens without you knowing because it happens too slowly. I was noticing a pattern starting to appear, but I didn't quite pick up on it, that the Globalist project was already starting, encouraging women to enter the workforce, saying that the family unit was evil, and that that was the beginnings of the Globalist project, or the earlier part of it at least. But I didn't quite see the connection early on. Bear in mind, I'm quite a young guy when that's sort of starting to kick off. So you already start to see the difference in composition of the advertising. So if I look at a newspaper, for example, I look at a newspaper from 1972 as an example, 1972, I look at a newspaper, and you can see these, like if you look at the local capital city library, they've got a huge store of information there, and you can pull these newspapers and journals out, and you can review them. Now you do a quick count and say, well, 92% of the advertising revenue is the private sector. Businesses advertising their products, or positions vacant, jobs, help wanted, all that sort of stuff. And very little of it was government. It may be just a government notice. The government puts out a statement that there's an intended land release in a certain area, for example. There may be those sorts of things. So really, you've got hardly any government advertising at all. Where it is government advertising, it's more that the government is required by the statutes to state that it could be, say, the court cases being heard in the local court, that type of thing. And they paid for that, or some of it. Now you start to see the more editorial and the more stories that are dedicated, this is in the newspapers, the major mastheads, dedicated to pushing what now we can see was the globalist agenda. You then see the mix of advertising change, that the proportion of advertising from the private sector starts to decline and the advertising paid for by the taxpayer starts to increase. And that increase is related to the amount of column inches, that the newspaper has that's dedicated to justifying that, the family is a bad thing. And this is, women should be going out to work, and delay having children, don't have children. You divorce that damn fucking oppressor bum because he's oppressing you. And that sort of stuff was becoming more prevalent. And at that same time, the amount of government advertising increased. So newspapers are already conceding the ground. They're saying, okay, we're going to stop printing facts. We're going to stop printing accurate. We're going to start printing propaganda. The government in return says, well, we're going to ask you to print these propaganda stories. And so we'll give you more money for advertising to make up for, because private advertisers, I don't like the look of that. I don't want my product to be advertised next to that sort of thing. And so, if you're advertising, I don't know, for household furniture or something like that, or those sorts of things, then you don't want your product being advertised next to something that says all men are evil oppressors and child molesters or wife beaters. Or, you don't want that sort of thing there. So you start to back off. So the private companies are looking at other ways of advertising. And so the government fills that void because they're putting propaganda in the newspaper, which are scaring away typical readers. So you can already see that sort of change occurring. Really, you start to notice them sort of around the mid-70s. I think it became, say, 74, 75. You started to see the beginnings. Now, I didn't spot it at the time. I can look back now and compare a 1972 newspaper to a 1975 newspaper and say, wow, gee whiz, look at the difference in the amount of government advertising there. That almost directly tracks the amount of pro-globalist type propaganda that we're seeing. So that trajectory continued, and really as we see the the internet become a bigger and bigger center of news, the masthead, the big names, whether it be media as in TV channels or newspapers, it doesn't matter. They started to lose ad revenue to the online stuff. Excuse me. And so they became less and less viable, but they were still needed as propaganda outlets by the governments who are pushing the globalist thing. We can't lose those propaganda pieces. We're pushing the globalist agenda here. And so the mix of what was factual news and well-reasoned, well-argued, even if it was editorial, well-argued and well-reasoned, then that was declining, and the amount of the economic viability of these major mastheads was being lost, but it was being made up by government advertising on one side, but also that they were being bought up by pro-globalist organizations where they could do cross-subsidizing. So, well, the news, that news outlet is hemorrhaging money, but we can pay for that. We can use that as a tax deduction against our other very profitable business, which is a cartel or a monopoly or an oligopoly, and is protected by the government. So it became an organized arrangement, propaganda delivery system between big business, pro-globalist big business, pro-globalist controlled governments that were keeping these mastheads in line to instead of push the high standard of journalism, factual journalism that was once the case, into just pushing propaganda, because they'd ceased to be economically viable. If it was a matter of economics, they'd have all gone out of business. So they had to be maintained and retained in order to for the sole purpose of pushing propaganda. It's these organisations that the globalists want to keep as the only medium of information delivery, and they structured it so and put it together as much, over the going back, as in the format of it all going back decades. There were a few other factors that played into this as well. If you wanted to have the latest current news, you had to go. There was you could go to the TV stations. But the TV stations often wouldn't quite get there a whole lot in front of the newspapers at the time. And I remember there used to be sections of the newspapers in red, which would be the last minute news that had come in, around the world or locally. And this is in the newspapers. You could get, so the view was that if you wanted the latest hot off the press type news, you could still get it from a newspaper, and of course, factually delivered and checked and verified and all that sort of stuff. That, of course, changed because the online, the internet could respond far more quickly, and so when it came to factual, when it came to factual news delivery, such as there was an assassination here, or a volcano exploded there, or there was a 5 million car pile up down the expressway, or those sort of facts. It was an event. It was fact. It happened at this time on that day in that place. That sort of breaking hot off the press type news, that could be handled by the internet. So the newspapers and the other media, your legacy media, couldn't quite sort of catch up with, or they couldn't do better than that. So if they were going to attract eyeballs, they just couldn't do it on facts alone. There was too much competition from the internet. So they had to add analysis. Analysis became propaganda, and so on. So they had to change the format of their delivery anyway. And once they moved away from reporting facts, which they kind of had to, because they couldn't have the jump on the internet with just factual reporting. And by the time we got through the newsroom, it was scripted and put out there. There was already some online, citizen journalists that had made the announcements. It was all over the internet and so on. So they had to change that format of delivery, and so they had to go down an opinion path, which just 100% lent itself to propaganda delivery. If we're going to do an opinion, we might as well deliver our propaganda. We might as well help the globalist project while we're at it. Now, because their lies have become so obvious and so constant, a barrage of lies upon lies upon lies and more lies again. And that's obvious pretty much to well, not to everybody, I guess, but to most people. Then it itself created, they lost all credibility. And so, and trust that they had buckets of at one stage, and they've squandered every bit of this trust and cynically used the trust as a way of saying, well, these people trust us, we can tell them any lie we want and they'll believe us. And they went down that path. Of course, now they've lost the trust there as well. So now they have to try and repair the issue, if you will. We've lost trust. No one believes us anymore. They know we're telling lies. So how are we going to, do something about? Well, what are we going to do about this? We'll just make sure that no one else can talk. And so they have to believe our lies because there's no other information out there. And that's really where they're going with this misinformation, disinformation thing. By the way, the Soviets, all the communist societies did exactly the same thing. And in the end, no one believed what the communist societies were saying. I've spoken to people who came out of the Soviet Union, and they had a 100% state-controlled media that again, told them. The Soviet Union, and they had a 100% state-controlled media that again, told the most outrageous lies. But very few people actually believed it, and when the Soviet Union fell over, because you could be put into prison for not believing that this is where I think we're heading here with the globalists. If you don't believe the lies they tell you, And it may not be that you disagree or you've questioned it. You may not be 100% fully on board with believing the lie. That they may put you in prison. And in the case of the Soviet Union and, say, communist China, they could even kill you. That you don't believe our lies as much as we want you to believe them, so we're going to kill you. And that type of thing. And so I think this is, we're on the road to that already here in the West. The globalists are determined that they and only they can have a view on anything, and they can impose that view under threat of imprisonment and so on. That's where they're going. And this was very much part of the communist thing. But when the Soviet Union fell over, 1990, and it came out that hardly anyone believed the news anyway. They pretended to believe it. They pretended to be going along with, oh yeah. And but the reality is that 3 out of 4 people thought it was just absolute lies. Half of the rest thought it was a bit dubious, and you had maybe 10% that believed that the mentally defective folks believed it, or the ideological fanatics believed it because they needed to believe it because that was the only way they could support the ideology, is if they believed the lies, which is what you see, by the way, with the the World Economic Forum. Those people talking there about misinformation and disinformation, they have to believe it because these are very ordinary, low rent, low IQ people, the Chrystia Freelands and all that sort of thing. They have to believe this nonsense or pretend to believe it because it's the only way they can sleep at night. But that's my take on the whole thing. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.